trying to tease out the tones in Thai. The purpose of this video is trying to understand why tones, so characteristic of Thai, are represented so seemingly awkwardly in modern Thai orthography, because anyone who will have looked into Thai will know what a daunting topic it can be to grasp. Southeast Asian alphabets are very peculiar, because they're adaptations of foreign alphabets firstly, and because their orthography is highly conservative, preserving many features from earlier times secondly. First things first, for obscure reasons many people tend to call the individual letters alphabets, whereas an alphabet is indeed always a set of different letters or characters. Technically, South and Southeast Asian alphabets are rather so-called abugidas, where a non-marked grapheme or basic character usually stands for a syllable, and diacritics then denote specific vowel changes in the syllable. But I'll still call these abugidas alphabets for convenience's sake here. The individual basic letters are called akshara in Sanskrit or akkara in Pali, or any of its equivalents in other Indo-Spheric languages. Again, they're not alphabets, they're elements within alphabets that in turn function in ways very different to, say, the Latin alphabet. All Southeast Asian alphabets sprang from common origins, be it, for example, the Burmese Myanmar alphabet depicted here, or be it also the complex dependent vowel signs and subscript consonants of Burmese. Again, a single basic akshara stands for a syllable. Therefore, if I want to denote the different vowel or consonant clusters, I have to employ sophisticated methods. The Khmer alphabet is of the very same origin, no matter how different to Burmese the shapes may seem at first glance. Tracing back the shapes to their common origin is a complex topic in its own right that I'll omit here. And we also see similar, rather sophisticated ways of expressing dependent vowels as well as consonant clusters. Khmer is an outlier since it's not a tonal language, albeit surrounded by a myriad of tonal ones, but Khmer does have so-called vowel registers, meaning that a single vowel diacritic may denote different vowels depending on the sound preceding it. The sound, not the letter, because the letter for the preceding sound can sometimes follow it. This is just to whet your appetite because I want to reserve detailed treatment thereof for future content. An alphabet from which the modern Khmer script developed is also ancestral to the Thai alphabet. Things fork over time. Thus, the modern Khmer alphabet and the modern Thai alphabet are both children of an older script. And even this particular on-screen rendition of Elder Khmer is the child of the actual father. They're not ancestors to one another, they're cousins. So this is the Thai alphabet as we know it today. As far as the vowels are concerned, I'm only displaying the vowel grapheme repertoire representing Sanskrit and Pali sounds. There are more diacritics, including the tone markers we eventually want to get to. Also, Thai, as one of only a few so-called Brahmic writing systems, does not use subscript consonants. Most Brahmic scripts, including Thai, do however not write spaces between every two words. As is the case for most other alphabets, there can be several sets of glyphs representing the same set of graphemes, essentially different fonts. What we see here is a simplified variant with fewer curls and squiggles that you will encounter on an everyday basis in Thailand though. Lao finally is basically a simplified version of Thai, even though languages are closely related, where Thai orthography is very historical and etymological, sometimes employing numerous different letters for the same sound, depending on the word's origin. Lao opted for a more phonological approach. It's easier to write, but it conversely obscures the origin of words. You win some, you lose some. There are even more Southeast Asian alphabets. We only had a cursory glance at the most prominent ones. The vast majority of those, as well as the vast majority of South Asian alphabets, sprang from the so-called Brahmi or Brahmi script that developed in North India almost 2.5 millennia ago. Its influence can hardly be overemphasized. This is its basic repertoire of aksharas. I'm just briefly showing it here. We'll not cover it in depth this time around. It also gave rise to most North Indian scripts, including the so-called Devanagari, Devanagari, that managed to gain considerable prominence since it's the standard script for Hindi as well as Sanskrit, although both languages have been couched in many different scripts over time, especially Sanskrit. There is hardly a South or Southeast Asian script Sanskrit has not been written with. The south of India is dominated by the so-called Dravidian languages, such as Tamil or Malayalam, originally as unrelated to North Indian languages as English and Chinese are. But both families have, of course, heavily influenced each other over time. Vedic and Buddhist culture, including the Brahmi script, conquered the south as well as the north. What we see here is the Grantha script in a modern guise. Its precursor spawned most South as well as Southeast Asian scripts. Brahmic scripts have spread as far as Indonesia and even the Philippines. We see the basic repertoire of Javanese here, a variant of which is also used in Bali, albeit with ever-decreasing popularity. Understanding the orthography of Thai tones, the core topic of this very video, requires some understanding of Thai consonants first. We do not have to go into all the details of Brahmi, all the vowels and consonants, or indeed the sophisticated logic behind their sequence, which there is, because there's a lot to say about it. Let's just briefly glimpse at the full repertoire. And let's also leave the vowels aside for now. but one vowel, the simple a, has still made it into the smaller grid because it can be construed as a glottal stop plus the unmarked vowel a. We'll also not go through all the consonants here. It shall suffice to notice that there are basically 4 sets of stops. Simple voiceless sounds such as ka, da, ba, as we encounter them in French, for example, and their simple voiced analogues such as ga, da, ba, just like in English. But also aspirated versions thereof. Voiceless aspirated sounds such as ka, ta, pa, those are the ones we hear in English, as well as voiced aspirated ones, ga, da, ba. The latter are very characteristic of North Indian languages. The Buddha is actually pronounced Buddha. Now, Thai originally preserved all of these distinctions, and it still does, at least in orthography. By the way, I opted for the modern letter forms, while still juxtaposing them with earlier sound equivalents. The earlier forms looked markedly different to the modern ones, but this video is less about form, more about function. Over time, Thai lost some of the earlier distinctions. The different S-like sounds, so-called sibilants, were all merged into a simple S, but still distinguished in writing. And the Indian retroflex sounds, such as da or da, coalesced with simple dental sounds, such as da or da. Another substantial change was the devoicing and aspiration of any voiced stops. This will prove crucial for the understanding of tone orthography later on. An earlier ga gradually turned into a ka, and an earlier da turned into a ta, etc. By the way, the unmarked vowel isn't necessarily an a in Thai anymore, it's rather usually an o. Time can change a multitude of intersecting things, either simultaneously or successively. In addition to that, Thai also added 9 letters to represent sounds absent from Sanskrit or Pali, but very much present in earlier Thai. This allowed Thai to express the coexistence of aspirated sounds versus fricatives. Fricatives are sounds where the tongue only approximates the position of the corresponding stop, but doesn't complete the touch, thus allowing for air to produce friction, as in, indeed, the word friction, the F. For example, pa versus fa, or ka versus ha. Earlier Thai also distinguished between quote-unquote normal voiceless stops and presumably preglottalized ones, say da versus da. Plus it had a voiced H sound, as we hear it in Czech, for example, aha, expressed by a variation of the akshara for the glottal stop, ah. Well, times change, and so it came to pass that many of these formerly important distinctions were altered or even vanished altogether, but the distinct letters remained. Only some of the fricatives made it into modern Thai, such as fa, although all of them turned voiceless. Others turned into voiceless aspirated stops after all. Ha became ka. The presumably voiceless preglottalized stops turned into voiced implosives, da and ba, etc. And I had only been talking about changes at the beginning of syllables, in the so-called Auslaut, the end of syllables of words. Even fewer distinctions remain. All stops, for example, yielded only 3 outcomes, essentially very short versions of a K, T and P. Thus, it will probably not come as a surprise that the extra letters Thai had added earlier on underwent the same reduction at the end of syllables. Up to 16 different letters can thus be pronounced the same, which is but a short, unreleased T. But again, Thai writing is conservative, whereas the language has been quite innovative. That's the entire reason for all this confusion. Can we finally get to Thai tones now? Well, now that we know a little bit about the history of Thai orthography, we can get closer to a more thorough understanding of otherwise random facts. Here are the Thai consonants within their Brahmic grid. The blue ones are the original Brahmic ones, and the red ones are the Thai newcomers. These fall into 3 broad categories or classes. The red ones were originally voiceless, unaspirated stops, such as ka. The yellowish ones were originally voiceless aspirates, such as ka, whereas the brownish ones were originally voiced consonants, such as ga. No matter how they changed subsequently, they had different effects on vowels following them, as well as their tones. Grammarians called the class of originally voiceless unaspirated stops mid-tone, the class of originally voiceless aspirates high tone, and the class of originally voiced consonants low tone, not just stops, all consonants. Originally, it simply meant that the more voice you add to a consonant at the beginning of a syllable, the lower you start out, which is also true for English in a sense. Kut can sound a little higher than gut. Similar effects took place in, say, Tibetan. However, the lower you start a syllable, the higher you can end it. We shall see that syllables starting with low consonants eventually did not come to assume a low syllable tone in Thai after all, which is why the denominations can be somewhat misleading from a modern point of view. We're not quite done with the preamble yet, although we've already seen the tonal classes of consonants at the beginning of syllables. Thai does have diacritics, little extra fleety floaty characters, for the designation of tones, but it also has automatic tones depending on the nature of the rest of the syllable. The distinction is called live versus dead. Dead syllables are essentially ones ending in hard stops, whereas live ones are undead in a sense, hence syllables ending in a long vowel, a diphthong, or a gliding sound such as an N. An N does not suddenly stop, it lives on. So dead syllables are primarily ones ending in uk, up, the short unreleased K's, T's and P's, or indeed syllables ending in just a short vowel, because those really still do end, or in other cases at least used to end, in a glottal stop in Thai. Just like in the dialectal English I get it, so not I get it, but I get it. Whereas live syllables don't end abruptly. They quote unquote live on. Again, just like in live on. Now we can fill the grid of all the different tones that vowels assume depending on, firstly, the tonal class, middle, high and low, secondly, the syllable category, live or dead, and thirdly, different kinds of diacritics. This is the seemingly daunting part. Let us visualize the tones in a single grid and try to break it down into pieces. A live syllable usually produces a neutral tone. Not very high, not very low, not very rising, not very falling. Ma. A dead syllable, or indeed the first tone mark, actually a small Brahmic 1 above the akshara, usually produces a low tone, a relatively lower register than the speaker's normal voice, slightly creaky. Ma. If you need mnemonics, the accent mark, the small stroke, weighs the akshara down, and the dead speak with a creaky voice and lie low. The second tone mark, actually a small Brahmic 2 above the akshara, and actually not dissimilar to our so-called Arabic numeral 2. They usually produce a falling tone. It starts higher than neutral and jumps a tad before falling down to the low tone. Ma. This is one of the two contoured tones, the other being the rising tone that we'll get to in a minute. If you need mnemonics, think of the accent mark as a small animal with a tail that jumps a little and lands low. Then, there are the much rarer and newer third and fourth accent marks for high and rising tones respectively. Ma and ma. The high tone is in fact slightly rising in long vowels, whereas the rising tone starts lower than neutral, dips a little and rises quite a bit, the opposite of a falling tone. Again, these are actual older digit marks above the aksharas. The third accent mark were three little strokes that were squigglishly joined together, and a small cross symbol denotes the four directions of the fourth mark. You can remember the first three tone marks standing in for three major categories. Firstly low, thirdly high, and the in-between a 2, which is falling. The rising tone number 4 is an outlier. Now the low class is an exception, mainly due to the aforementioned process of devoicing originally voiced consonants. Originally voiced consonants feature falling tones when marked with a first marker, originally denoting low tones as we noted earlier, and high tones when marked with a second marker, originally denoting falling tones as we noted earlier. As you can infer from the diagram, they slide up one level when compared to the other tonal classes of consonants. In a sense, originally voiced consonants merely anticipate the tone. They produce a high tone but do not fall, or they fall but they are not low. The process is more complex than this, but think of heightening the low initial consonant in a syllable with a first tone mark, denoting a low syllable ending. Due to the heightening of the beginning of the syllable, we get a falling tone movement. Conversely, an already contoured syllable bearing the second tone mark remained high after the devoicing, and hence heightening of the initial consonant. The high tone is more contoured in the first place, and distinguishing it from the newly contoured syllables bearing the first tone mark may have played a role as well. Similarly, dead syllables, starting with originally voiced consonants, also rise up by at least one level. Dead syllables with long vowels get a longer, more contoured falling tone, and dead syllables with short vowels get a shorter high tone. The actual reasons are more complex, but we can clearly observe that the devoicing and aspiration of originally voiced consonants made their syllables rise in the grid, because syllables with them started out lower in the first place, hence low class, but they came to start out higher during the process of devoicing. The question if and when the two different types of dead originally produced two different tonal shapes in the mid and high tonal classes as well is beyond our current scope. We're almost done. It needs to be stated that the high class actually never produces a high tone, neither does the low class produce a low tone. Therefore, as I stated earlier on, their monikers can be somewhat misleading because they really only describe the nature of the syllable unlaut, its beginning. It can be more intuitive to indeed remember them as voiceless, aspirated and voiced originally, of course. And finally, original aspirated consonants don rising tones in live syllables, not neutral ones. They start out highest and even return to that level so as to produce an outlier tone, the rising one. There are no syllables starting with a low consonant to receive a rising tone, and no syllables starting with a high consonant to feature a neutral tone. Here, the class monikers are not misleading. So if you remember the quote-unquote usual or normal meanings of the tone marks, however less statistically usual they might have become over time, it's really just the outliers framed in this slide that one has to understand separately. Apart from the rising tone, after original aspirates we saw on the previous slide, it's the original voiced consonants that mess up the picture. Well, all because Thai messed with their original voicedness in the first place. If you only want to learn Thai, thinking in terms of original versus modified might seem like surplus information. But firstly, Thai orthography is complex for that very reason, that it still betrays etymological origins. And secondly, if you want to look past Thai, it will immediately become apparent that all South and Southeast Asian languages borrowed heavily from Sanskrit and or Pali. They form the so-called Indosphere, after all. However different the rendition of those Indic words might sound in the individual languages, they'll usually be written with exactly analogous aksharas as well as diacritics. Thai sawati, hello, sounds nothing like Khmer suastai, also hello, but they both go back to Indic svasti and are still written exactly like that. By the way, the same svasti we know from the swastika. And so it is that where Thai does not have voiced sounds anymore, their effects linger on in the tonal realm, and you will see and hear actual voiced sounds in Thai words of Indic origin when pronounced by speakers of languages that still have voiced stops. Plus, it lets you understand how the beginning and ending of syllables, as well as subsequent devoicing, can lead to different tones. As a side note, there are different ways of representing, remembering, and ordering the categories, say moving consistently from low to high across both axes, but the more traditional approach I took earlier on has more historical explanatory power in this case. The best suggestion is perhaps to play with the grid according to your individual pace and to add a pinch of salt to taste. Finally, other Thai dialects and Thai languages written TAI without the H will display tones very different to standard Thai, but the general gist of squaring tone behavior towards the end of a syllable with changing tone behavior at its beginning due to devoicing of consonants remains the same. That'd be that for this time. Cheers for tuning in.